pleasure to be the moderator for today's session on sustainable aviation. So I think for the purpose of recording, we will be speaking on a microphone. And I'm pleased to have you here. My name is Christopher Lilholm. I am from DNV. And I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists, Andrew Matters and Halfdan Dot. And if I may ask you, just if you can briefly introduce yourself. But before you introduce your organizations, if you can also introduce a fun fact about yourself.
Thanks, Christopher. Yes, I'm Andrew Matters. I work at IATA. I'm the Director of Policy there at IATA. As an economist by background, fun facts are a bit thin on the ground. I think in terms of my career in aviation, while I was working at Qantas, I was qualified to operate on the ramp. So loading, unloading aircraft, doing all that fun sort of stuff that you see every time we get on and get off as passengers, everything that's happening on the ramp. So formerly I was qualified to be involved in that part of the business as well.
Great to hear that. So you are also having the experience that the suitcases are with us when we are traveling. That's very important. Yes, thank you. That was a good fact. And yes, Halfdan, maybe from you.
So it's interesting that you call me Halfdan because that is what my name actually means, half Danish. And so it does come from that. But it's a Scottish name. The sons and daughters of the Vikings, the half Danes. But that's actually kind of my fun fact, is the fact that I'm from Scottish and English birth. I grew up partially in New Zealand. I now live in Switzerland. And I think that the reason that I got into aviation was I spent a lot of my childhood on planes, going back and forth between New Zealand and the United Kingdom. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about the work that we do in aviation now, is because we've created this world in which air transport is actually a really important part of people's lives, not just from a business perspective, but also just from a personal perspective as well, and keeping those family ties alive. And we want to make sure that everybody has that opportunity, and that we can make sure that we have a future for aviation that is not only connecting more people in the world, but also doing it in a sustainable way. And so that's really why I do what I do every day.
How inspiring. And this also brings us to today's session, because we want to bring everyone above the sky. So as we want to mobilize people to be able to come around the world and explore the world, learn from the world, and also bring goods across the entire planet, there's going to be a need for more transportation, more people to travel, and that's going to also have a planetary impact. And so this session today will actually be around this topic and how we can create the mobility, the flexibility to get around. And I agree with your point, it's super captivating also since child to fly. And we all came here, most of us, I think in majority, through a plane, and we wouldn't be able to meet it otherwise. So when that being said, what do you see as the latest technology innovations shaping aviation in a more decarbonized way? You are with the mic, Halfdan.
So I'll go first. So when, as an industry, we set our goal of net zero carbon by 2050, we didn't just do that because it was a nice headline. We actually did a lot of work and a lot of research to figure out how we could make that happen, whether it was even possible, and then we were able to set the goal at that point because we were comfortable that this was a potential for us to do. And we look at a range of different options there. So we look at new technology, certainly, and there's a lot of discussion around electric and hydrogen aviation. We look at improvements in operations and infrastructure to make sure that we are flying as effectively as we can and efficiently as we can. We also look at new types of fuel, so sustainable aviation fuel is a big part of that wedge. And then for any residual emissions or any remaining emissions, we need to turn to market-based measures. And of course, that will start moving more and more towards carbon removals over time. So we're looking at all those different options. The whole industry has this strategy in the same way. And that's really important because it means that we're all united, we're all working together in a sort of common approach to that. Because, of course, the aviation industry relies on a lot of coordination on a daily basis to get even one flight off the ground. We do that all the time anyway. So I think that there's a whole range of really interesting things that we can pull out there over the course of the next discussion. On the technology side, certainly I see there's some really interesting evolving discussions around electric aircraft, but generally that is a very small scale of aircraft. So this is a 19-seat, maybe up to 30 or so seat aircraft. There's also hybrid electric, which is becoming a much more realistic opportunity as well. Again, for relatively small aircraft, but it means that we can use electric or hydrogen fuel cells and also jet fuel, traditional jet fuel or sustainable aviation fuel to power those aircraft in a hybrid way, a bit like a Prius to a certain extent. That's relatively small scale aircraft. On the hydrogen side, there's a lot of research being done in this space, understanding that this could be a really important opportunity in the longer term for aviation. But that's really in the small and kind of small, medium size and short haul aircraft at this stage. And so those two together mean that we can actually take a lot of the flights onto different types of energy. But the majority of our CO2 emissions come from medium and long haul flights, where sustainable aviation fuel is going to be really the most important strategy. And maybe I can leave Andrew to talk a bit more about sustainable aviation fuel.
Thanks, Howard. You know, it's not the flying that's the problem. It's the emissions from flying that's the problem. And what we, as an industry, what we want to get to the point where we fix the problem, which is the emissions, so that we continue to fly. Because we really believe that as an industry, there's a lot of value that from aviation. It's not just moving people from, or boxes from one point to another point. It's the relationships, it's the opportunities culturally, socially. It creates business opportunities with the transfer of technology, capital, international trade, all of those things. I think that story is well known, but I think it's nonetheless worth iterating that it's not flying itself that's the problem we need to address here. Okay, thank you. I think, you know, to the point that Haldane makes, we really need to be thinking in multiple time horizons as we look at the industry's sustainability transition. So, you know, we need to think about what can we do right now. If we're going to get to net zero by 2050, we need to start right now. But there are limited options of what we can do, and Haldane spoke about, you know, the hydrogen, some of those technologies, the electric technologies, which we don't have in large scale right now. We're working on those. We need to keep working on those. We also need to be thinking about the sorts of things that we can do right now. And I guess just quickly, before I get to SAF, on the technology side, you know, there's some really interesting things happening in terms of aircraft and engine manufacturing as well. And I think people would be familiar with some of the radical aircraft designs that are being thought about, and the contribution that they can make. And that's also very important to the point that we need to have collaboration across the value chain. And this is not a transition that airlines can do by themselves. It takes the whole value chain, airports, the manufacturers, everyone collaborating, working together to deliver this net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Certainly, for the time being, SAF is front and center for us as an industry, because it is one of the things that we can do now. We have a couple of problems with SAF at the moment, and the first of those is, quite simply, there's not much of it. And that's our first challenge, that we need to ramp up the production of SAF. Just to put this into a little bit of context, you know, we estimate that for 2024, there's about 1 million tonnes of SAF globally. That equates to about 0.5% of total jet fuel demand. What's really exciting is that we see there's a lot of interest. There is investment going into SAF to build plants to increase the production, so that by 2030 we think that there could be around 50 million tonnes of SAF. So we're going from 1 to 50 through the rest of the decade. So there's very clearly a sharp ramp up there, and that's great to see, until perhaps you understand that we think we need about 500 million tonnes by 2050. So it's a very big challenge for us. But this is a place where we can start with SAF right here, right now, to really accelerate, I think, the journey towards a more sustainable aviation industry.
Perfect. You actually came to some of my next questions on this topic, because technology seems to be there. There are different technology maturities. Some are more evident, some are more evolving. Electric flights for the smaller hybrid models. I believe that a large part of the power need for an aircraft is in the uplift. Are there any thoughts around different ways to do an uplift, or different ways to combine? Is it for sectors that are more suitable for electric planes, like you say, smaller planes? Is it more cargo planes, well fitted for that, and SAF well fitted for passenger planes? Or how do you see that?
Yeah, it's more about the size of the aircraft and the ability for those aircraft to reach certain destinations. And so if you look at the smaller commuter-size aircraft, generally they're able to reach smaller communities as well. And that's actually a really important part of the value of aviation story as well. It's not just about the big global hubs like the Heathrows and the Charles de Gaulle's and the Singapores of this world. Actually, aviation is really, really important to small island states, to remote communities in countries all over the world that are very hard to access by other means of transport. And so those smaller communities are really great opportunities for electric size aircraft. Whether the aircraft are carrying people or whether they're carrying cargo doesn't really matter. It's about the size of the aircraft and the availability of technology there. So I think what we'll see is, over the course of this decade, probably having electric or hybrid electric aircraft at small scale. On the hydrogen side, there's a lot of work going on in that space, but we probably won't see aircraft until the 2035 to 2040 timeframe, if they are a reality. And so that's why Andrew's point about SAF being available today is so really important. And the other thing that we can do today is start improving the operational elements of the flight. And so this is air traffic management, this is on the ground taxiing to the runway, and this is the way that we fly aircraft as well. And there's already been a huge amount that's been done in this space. Just a fun fact for you, the CO2 emissions of a flight that you take today are over 50% less than the same flight would have been in 1990. So we've actually improved our efficiency enormously already. We can continue to do that bit by bit, while we also wait for some of the bigger step changes in technology or availability of SAF to come into the space as well.
Excellent, great. So it has a positive outlook, and there is a plan for SAF.
It's positive outlook, but it doesn't mean that it's not hard. It's a real challenge to get all these things going, real challenge to get SAF going, and that's the key thing, is scaling up. So we're already flying on SAF today out of a number of airports, very small quantities, but how do we scale that up? How do we build the business case to make sure that there is the supply side going? How do we make sure that the policy space is right? And that's one of the reasons why these discussions here at these events are so important, because we're going to need government support to do that in a variety of different ways. And the policy support is really, really important there as well. We've developed a global level of policy support through ICAO, through the UN body that looks at aviation specifically. And so they've got a goal already on sustainable aviation fuel deployment, which is that by 2030 we need a 5% reduction in the carbon intensity of the fuel that we use. And SAF is a really big part of that at a global level. And so that's why getting work going in the next year and a half to 2 years is going to be really vital to meet that goal, and then shoot upwards from there towards hopefully a complete replacement of our fossil fuel supply with sustainable aviation fuel or other alternative energies by 2050. So that's a big challenge, and we're pushing as hard as we possibly can, but we need support from others to do that as well.
Excellent. You are going to lead to the next question, and I want also to ask Andrew the same. What are the policies that are going to help drive this going forward? Because, okay, we can see that there are technologies, there are transition pathways. Which are the policies? Are they enough? What are they inclusive? Do they give everyone an opportunity to continue flying as we started this discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the policy dimension here, I think, is a very important one, but it's also quite a complex one, because we're a global industry. We are dealing with national governments who have different priorities, different ability to engage in policy activity, and a different level of interest, to be blunt at times. So all of these things create challenges. I think there are two broad points that I'd like to make on the policy side. The first one is, people often think that policy is about putting your hand out for money. I think the discussion needs to be more mature than that. This is not about airlines, the aviation sector, putting their hand out for money from governments, because there are plenty of different ways that policies can provide an enabling environment that supports the energy transition for our industry without necessarily having to hand over cash. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think is also important is we need to perhaps stop looking at just aviation, that this is an aviation problem. This is part of a global energy transition problem that we have. Aviation is a part of that, and we're absolutely doing our best to contribute to changing that situation. But we're one part of a broader policy discussion that needs to be had. And so I think that the policy conversations need to reflect that. They need to be broader. They need to be more holistic in terms of how do we address this global energy transition problem. And then where does aviation fit into that? Because I think, and I'm not going to name names, but I think there are plenty of examples where governments, usually with good intentions, have implemented policies, perhaps not thinking about the bigger picture, and that has led to some unintended consequences which have actually proven to be unhelpful for the environment, for what we're fundamentally trying to achieve through those policy initiatives. So it's very difficult, I think, to say this is the policies that need to be implemented, because, as I said, different circumstances in different countries. Having said that, we have recently published a paper, a comprehensive paper. It's a policy roadmap where we have tried to identify, and again we're looking at 3 different time horizons here, because policy needs to evolve over time out to 2050. It's not just put policy in place now and then we're done. But I'd encourage anybody who's interested in understanding the complexity and some of the various issues involved in thinking about policy and what the options might be, to have a look at IATA's Net Zero Policy Roadmap. It's available on our website, and there's a lot of detail in there, which is probably a bit too much for us to go into in this conversation today.
I just want to build on that, and the thing that's sort of reminding me of this part of the discussion is this picture on the wall in the pavilion here, which is a whole series of maps of members of WGO, and I think that's really important to remember, is that at the moment we have 92% of our fuel in the world coming from just 22 countries. Whereas when we look at something like sustainable aviation fuel, actually the ability to democratize and to diversify our supply of fuel can be spread to much more of the world and many more countries in the world. And that's one of the things that we do with the International Civil Aviation Organization, is to try and ensure that the opportunities for SAF development, for new projects, for new energy industries, and for energy security in those countries as well, is able to be spread not just in North America and Europe, where a lot of the focus has been so far, but to countries all over the world, and making sure that they are equipped with what they need to from a capacity building perspective so they can understand the opportunities, but also from a policy perspective so that they can put in place the right mechanisms to help with that scale up over time as well. So we're seeing a few different policy approaches at the moment in different ways. That's always going to be the case at the start of a transition. You're going to have slightly different approaches in different parts of the world, and we'll learn from each other. And I think that's the really important thing, is to understand what policies are working, what policies maybe aren't working so well, and learn from each other's and learn from the experience as we go forward. We don't have a lot of time to do it. We want to try and push this as fast as possible, but you know, we're at a really exciting stage in this evolution, if you like.
Great. I think, Andrew, you wanted a
Sorry,
comment?
could I just, very quickly add to that? One of the things that we need to balance, we've got all these things happening at a national policy level. We shouldn't forget the point that I made earlier, that aviation is a global industry, and we need to find a balance between the national level policy but some sort of global harmonization, some sort of global standards. And that's a tricky conversation to have, but it's a very important conversation to have. And I think that speaks to the importance of global organizations, for example, like ICAO, and the role that they need to play in this kind of conversation.
Great to hear that, Andrew. We are a company that works with global standards and helping companies document or navigate these standards and requirements. So that's definitely something that we could foresee, an area where we could be supportive of. I want to come back a little bit about the roadmaps and the future. We've talked about the technology that will bring good possibilities. We've talked about shifting fuels into more democratic ways, but we haven't talked about the passenger and the economic implication. Who is to pay when taking the flight? I believe that is...
Listen, I think the reality is that not only in the energy transition or the discussion on climate change in aviation, but also all other parts of the economy as well, there is going to be cost to that. There's also going to be a reduction in costs in some ways as well. As we make our aircraft more efficient, we can reduce the amount of fuel we use. But in general, we understand that the fuel that we use, the shift to sustainable aviation fuel, is going to be more expensive than the use of fossil fuels. And ultimately, passengers will pay for that. Now, at the moment, because we're really at an early stage, one of the things that a number of airlines are trying to work out is how can corporate customers, big companies that buy lots of airline tickets for their staff travel, how can they be a part of that discussion? How can they be maybe helping to pay a little bit of the price premium that comes with sustainable aviation fuel use, at least to help kickstart the process there and try and bring down the costs overall for everybody else in the future. So there's a lot of discussion going on around that. There are a number of schemes that are already in place to do that. But I think ultimately we do understand that it'll be a bit more expensive for us to buy fuel in the future. And in different ways, some of that will come down to passengers. But it's a really important part of our long-term strategy. In the end, we also understand that if we don't take this path, if we don't get towards net zero CO2 emissions from aviation or other sectors of the economy, we're going to have much bigger costs that will come later on anyway, to do with adaptation to the impacts of climate change, if we don't try and solve this problem, to do with insurance, to do with the cost of carbon, which will increase over time. And so the shift now, the strategic idea here is to try and ensure ourselves against some of those costs which will come later on anyway.
Thank you. Just to perhaps put a couple of numbers around this conversation, we've recently estimated the cost of the industry's net zero transition out to 2050 is going to be something in the order of $4.7 trillion. So it's a big sum of money that we're dealing with here. The other thing in terms of the cost of sustainable aviation fuel, that typically trades at a premium that's somewhere between sort of 2 and 4 times the cost of fossil-based jet fuel. So there's a significant price premium there that in this shift to SAF, airlines need to grapple with. So significant cost differentials. And of course, I guess the other part of that equation is that fuel costs for your average airline are something in the order of 25 to 30% of total operating costs. So it's a big chunk of the cost base that could be increasing by a substantial amount going forward. And that's why one of the reasons we're very keen to increase the production of SAF, to increase the supply of SAF, because we know that as those supply volumes increase, that price differential is going to be able to come down. Right? And I think in our policy roadmap, we talk about strategic policy sequencing and being smart about the types of policies that we implement and when. And really, initially, what we need is policies that are sort of technology push policies. And then we can transition to demand pull. Now, that's a fancy way of saying we need to build the industry. We need to build SAF production. We need to get those SAF volumes up. And once we've got that critical mass, the role of policy changes completely. And then it becomes much more a market-based, demand-driven market that is deep, that is liquid, that is transparent. We don't have that at the moment. And I think that's where some of the enabling policy can come into play to create that sort of environment for the SAF market, for SAF volumes and production to flourish, to increase.
Before I hand back the microphone to you, Halfdan, I wanted to elaborate a little bit of what you said here on both of you on the pricing that will ultimately impact the passenger. Right now, as a passenger, we will have to foresee a change, but still an availability over time, which gives us an access to the globe. But how do we make sure that the passenger's premium gets earmarked into the policies and the technologies and the resources and capabilities to make sure that there is enough fuel, to make sure there's enough investment in SAF and electrification of airlines, because that's a little bit beyond the control of the one booking a flight today and in the individual. So the allocation of capital to drive the transition, who will pay there? All right, so apologies. So we talked about the economic implications, and that there will be like 30 to 35% you mentioned of the total cost sits with the fuel. And we expect that the SAF will be a factor 2 to 4 on fuel, if I heard you correctly. So we can envision that can be at a price point from air travel over time. But the availability of the technologies and the investments in driving increased amount of SAF, you said in the beginning there was 0.5% available. How do we ensure sufficient investments to increase the availability, and how will that be financed?
Another great question. Do you want me to have an initial crack? I think, again, from unlocking finance is vital to this happening, right? And this is the other important part of the equation. This is not all just about policy. It's about getting the finance in place as well. And those. When we think about the aviation value chain, we think about airports and airlines and ground handlers and manufacturers and fuel suppliers. We often don't think so much about policymakers and regulators and the financial system, but they are absolutely critical in terms of this sustainability transaction. They are key stakeholders in all of this, and we need to understand how to get them engaged to support that energy transition. So when it comes to finance, we need to understand what are the problems that are impeding the flow of finance into our industry or into SAF production or whatever it is, right? And again, I think there is a broad role here for policy as well, to provide long-term certainty, which is what investors need.
Yes.
They're not going to put $1 billion into a biorefinery or whatever the sum is, if there's not that sort of stability of policy, the certainty of how the policy regime is going to evolve. It needs to be predictable, and we come back to that sort of global harmonization and the need for that as well. So at a very broad level, there's some of the things that the investors look for when they think about their risk return. And ultimately, that's what it all boils down to, right? It's from an investor's perspective, it's about risk and return. So the extent to which we can reduce risk or perhaps increase return is helpful for the investors and getting money into support these initiatives.
Yeah, I think it also goes a little bit back to what Andrew was saying right at the start, which is that the problem that we have as an industry and also a world is not necessarily the mobility or the flying, it's the CO2 emissions that come along with it at the moment. So if we can tackle that, that's really important. And so having goals in place that look at that side of things is really important, as opposed to just putting a tax on aviation or other things as well, which aren't necessarily hypothecated back towards the actual CO2 reduction opportunities. And a lot of governments will put a tax on, but not actually channel that money towards SAF use or technology or other forms of decarbonisation. So I think that the more efficient way to do that is for the industry to take control of that and to say we know we need to get rid of the CO2 emissions. This is our pathway to do it. Yes, there's going to be a cost that comes with that. We need this type of policy to help us build up the SAF supply in particular. And yes, there's going to be a higher cost to passengers, but that cost is going directly towards reducing CO2 emissions. The other thing that I think doesn't get spoken of enough in this is the cost of using fossil jet fuel. So at the moment, yes, SAF is 2 to 4 times the cost of fossil jet. Over time, the cost of using fossil jet will come with a carbon cost as well. So that will increase. Not necessarily the underlying price of the fuel itself, but certainly the cost of using that fuel and burning that fuel. Yep. So that needs to be taken into account as well.
And most probably that's what the investor scenarios are going to look like. They are going to look for certainty and confidence that say it's going to cost us more not to do anything than to invest into something. So investors are also going to look for trust and transparency in assets and transformations of assets. How do you see the role of trust in fuel claims taking form and shape?
I think this is a book and claim type discussion. Perfect for you.
It's very important, right? I know that there's a lot of concern out there around the potential for double counting, the environmental benefits associated with using SAF, for example. That absolutely is something people need to be confident in what's happening to make sure that it's all above board, that it is verifiable, that it is credible. And that's where we need a global accounting system for these transactions so that we can can keep track of exactly what's happening where. The other advantage about having this global accounting system, of course, is it means that the fuel can be produced anywhere in the world and it can be used somewhere else. So the environmental attributes can be claimed by others elsewhere. So that provides us with that global accounting framework which gives the certainty, which gives the trust, that again is vital to underpin these initiatives.
Maybe also just make a mention of what airlines are looking at from the Article 6 discussions, not relating to SAF, but relating to the accounting side of things. Okay.
Sorry, I invite you, Halfdan, to...
Sure. So one of the other things that I think is really important about this process here in Baku and at COPs just generally is the availability of carbon credits to be used under the International Civil Aviation Organization's CORSIA scheme. And so the conclusion, or hopeful conclusion, of the Article 6 talks here in Baku, but certainly under the UNFCCC, are really important for that. They're not specifically about aviation, but of course airlines need to be a user of these carbon credits that can be generated and verified and trusted under the UN system based on the Article 6 discussions here. So that's really important for us to look at as well. We understand that that's not the long-term solution for aviation, but certainly it is for the next 10 years at least for us to be able to offset the CO2 emissions that we are producing.
Right. Very good input as well, linked to linking it to the topic of the COP as well, and other things that are in the ecosystem and in the value chain. So now that we are here in Baku, and as we are going to close our session with thanks to all your insightful comments, I would like to ask you some final question linked to here at COP. What do you see as a key takeaway for the industry? And Halfdan, may I ask you first, and as you're with the mic?
Sure. I think a lot of people who don't come to COPs maybe don't understand the operating environment of a climate talks. So there's the official negotiations, which are all happening in a number of rooms over that way, and really important part of the the multilateral process to deliver some of these big policy discussion items. Then there's a whole lot of other activities that take place on the side, like in these types of pavilions, but also a lot of bilateral discussions between different business groups, between those who are working in different areas of the space. And so I think the main takeaway for us, here at least, has been the enormous interest that there is from places outside of the pure aviation side on sustainable aviation fuel, and the ability for different parts of the economy to help in that scale-up process. So I'm really impressed at seeing that. Of course, there are a number of parts of the negotiations that we follow, like Article 6, but more important actually at the moment for us is really being able to have those discussions with governments about the right policies that we can put in place for SAF, and also with other business groups about the things that they can do to help support the SAF scale-up. So yeah, it's a couple of different things there.
Fantastic. Great. Andrew?
Thank you. I totally agree with Halfdan on this one. I mean, I think the fact that everybody is here at this event with a single purpose in mind means that the conversations that you can have are moving in the same direction. And so to be able to meet with people that we perhaps wouldn't normally see, to have those conversations, and some of those conversations are difficult conversations, right? Where there is fundamental disagreement, but we need to have those conversations to be able to find ways to resolve the differences that we have, to move things forward. And I think that's really been the value of this week. It's been a very intense week, but the opportunity to meet with people, to have those conversations, and to understand different perspectives, different points of view, to share our perspectives and points of view, all with the same goal of improving the sustainability outcomes for the world.
Fantastic. I want to thank you once again, our distinguished panelists, for bringing so much insight linked to both technology, policy, and implementation, and discussing the challenging questions of economic implications, and being with us here today. So thank you very much, and I wish you a great COP ahead. It's been a pleasure being your moderator.